This shear is for a refuah shlema for Yafa something. One could fill in the blanks. I don't have it on me. Um, but anyways, let me get it.
I put it in the chat.
Put in the chat. Okay. Yafa Dina Baschaya Toiva. Okay, so we are in a very, very interesting part of Maseches Kiddushin. This is a big week, lots and lots of famous Gemaras. And I actually set out to do a little bit of a lot, and I ended up stuck on one particular sugya. So although sometimes I prefer quality over quantity, and sometimes I prefer quantity over quality, um, like when I prepare a share, for example, it's something called like when a writer starts writing, it's called stream of consciousness, where they just start looking at something and then just stuff comes into their head. So that's what kind of happened today. But we'll start on Daf Lamed. All right, Daf Lamed. Daf Lamed is talking about a number of subjects. The Gemara goes on a little bit of a tangent. It talks about teaching Torah to your sons as opposed to your daughters, right? That's what the Gemara is about. And about right the beginning of the wide lines, Gemara says, Amar of Safra Mishum Rabbi Yehoshua ben Chananya. Okay, that's what we're talking about now. This piece of Gemara that says, what does the pasuk mean when it says Vishinantam levanecha? Al tikra Vishinantam ela Vishilashtem. Gemara says, don't read Vishinantam, but rather Vishilashtam. Okay, the Shinantam connotes doing something twice. Shilashtem connotes something, doing something thrice, three times. And the Gemara says, La'olam yishalish adam shnosav shlish b'mikra, shlish b'mishnah, shlish b'talmud. The Gemara learns from here an important precept that says, because this pasuk hints to doing something three times, what the Gemara is referring to over here is splitting up your years into a third to learn Mikra, a third to learn Mishnah, and a third to learn Talmud. Okay, and that is the end of the Gemara. That is pretty much in 3 lines the end of the topic. So what I want to do is the first part, I want to start where the Gemara says Al Tikri. Just as an introduction, we know from several other agadatas in Shas that the Gemara likes to say Al Tikri a lot of times. So what does Al Tikri mean? Like, let's take a famous one. Something that we say every day, right? Al Tikri banayach ela bonayach, right? It's like a play on words where the Gemara will take a word and then say it's not pronounced this way, or it's not read this way, it's read that way. Al Tikri, like Morashaki Hilas Yaakov Orasa. Most of the time, the Al Tikri will be somewhat similar to what the Gemara ends off by saying. The problem is over here, this is not like something close, because Al Tikri Vishinantem Ella Vishilashtem, those two words sound nothing alike. They're not spelled the same. They have different letters. They don't even sound the same. So what's going on over here? So the truth is that Al Tikre is just an asmachta, meaning we could really, or the Gemara could really make any drasha they want to make, but we want to make it close. That's why it's called an asmachta. But how do we jump from this Al Tikre Vishinantem to the end result Vishilashtem? So the Pnei Yehoshua is actually bothered by this question. And the Pnei Yoshua says is, I'm reading from the Pnei Yoshua, he says, because you have to look at the pasuk before this. How does Shema start? It says, Vayu hadvarim ha'ele. Okay? And hadvarim ha'ele, the pasuk is referring to these words. What are these words? Well, the words of the Torah, right? So we know that dvarim ha'ele, I'm reading from Bnei Yoshua, he says, Vahayu hadvarim ha'ele, dahainu b'haviyosan. Right? When do you need repetition and really concentrating hard? That's when it comes to Torah Shabbat Peh, Shehi Mishnah Ugemara, De'ein Morin Halacha Mitocha Mishnah. Right? The Imken Shapir Kamer, Dief Shalikos Vishinantem, Ela Ikarina Nami Vishilashtem, Shief Shar Shi Hashum. All right. So he says that the word vishinantem has to be talking about the Torah. And he says further, right? The word shinantem means to repeat two things. Right? The word vishinantem, as we're going to see in the Chumash, right, actually is translated as to repeat. So what is repeat? Well, the hainu shtei toros, right? Omishum dechsev vishinantam bishnei nunin, right? Kamosh because of a maharsha. He brings on the maharsha that says it's repeating because just like the two nuns repeat each other, so too we are repeating, which is what Mishnah Torah is all about. He says v'imken v'hanach trei dahainu Mishnah ugemara shayach behunami shinun. So therefore, what is shinantem is referring to Torah Shabbat Peh. And what are the two concepts that we're talking about over here? Well, we're talking about Torah Shabbat Peh. So therefore, two of the three have to do with vishinantem. So what's left over? Right? Umilvad, he says, Torah Shebechsav, Dichsiv le'el minei vahiyu advarim ha'ele dahainu Torah Shebechsav. Therefore, what's left over is Torah Shebechsav, and that's satisfied, as the Bnei Yoshua starts off by saying, is by vahiyu advarim ha'ele. So, therefore, when the Gemara says vishinantem really means vishilashtem, it's just adding one, which is Torah Shebechsav, that vahiyu advarim ha'ele is, plus two, which is vishinantem. So that's what it means. Al tikre vishinantem ela vishilashtem. So that's the way the Pnei Yoshua explains the question of the Gemara, at least. So I thought I'd go into, before we tackle the second part, which is dividing up your years or your days or whatever, I wanted to have everyone take a look at this pasuk that we say every day. And I wonder if we actually know. I mean, we say this pasuk, we say Shema twice a day at least. Some people say 3, some people say 4 times, depending on davening. And I mean, we're saying it for decades. So it would be nice to know what this word vishinantem actually means in the eyes of the commentators. So whenever we start, right, we always start with either Rashi or Ibn Ezra. So let's leave Rashi for last, because the Rashi on this pasuk in Veschanan actually quotes our Gemara in Kiddushin. So the word vishinantem, okay, I'm reading from the Ibn Ezra. He says vishinantem megizrat chetz shanun. He says the word vishinantem comes, right, from the word chetz shanun, which is a pasuk in Mishlei, Perek Chafei, which basically means an arrow that is sharp. Okay? He says, V'yadua ech yishunan hachetz. It's known the method by which we sharpen an arrow. And the Ibn Ezra says, Hinei nira ki ikar kol adam avodas Hashem v'avodaso lahakir pa'alav. Right? The purpose of every man is to serve God. Right? And God's service consists of recognizing God's work. Lahakir pa'alosav amatika fetiku she'es kriyishma v'kulanu nispoch aleihen. And he concludes by saying that this is referring to, right, the Chachamim learn the time that this that the pasuk of V'shivtecha b'beisecha v'lechtecha b'derech is referring to the time. But the point of the Ebenezer is that he's at least explaining what the word vishinanta means. Because we know that in Hebrew, the word shena or shnia has a lot of meanings, right? And Yoshen, what's word Yashan means old, Yoshen means to sleep, right? Shnia means second, Lishnot means to repeat. So we have all these different possible words with seemingly the same shoresh. So that's the interpretation of the Ibn Ezra. If you look at the Haksava HaKabbalah, okay, he always gives these very charif, interesting comments. He says on this pasuk, he says, "V'shinantam levanecha gam b'zeh eino azhara biyuchad l'lamed es haTorah lebanim v'talmidim, aval hu bir el maimer ve'ahavta." He says, "V'shinantam is in the middle of the parsha." How does the parsha start? After Shema Yisrael, the very first pasuk is ve'ahavta Hashem Elokecha. He says you can't learn V'shinantam levanecha independent of the pasuk of V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha. He says, Ki ha'ohev yafarsem l'chol ma'alos ohavo. Because the one who is loving wants to publicize all of the advantages of loving. The Amr b'sifrei v'shinantam levanecha elo b'shinin ve'en kadosh li b'char b'shinin v'haka b'yacha. Okay. Hine bi'arnu lanu ki asharas v'shinantam musav al mitzvahs yichad ve'ahavta Hashem. He says it's all related. The Ve'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha is connected to Vishinantam. V'chen mima she'amar achav u'kshartem los al yadecha u'chtatam mezuzos. The tzivuyim elu lo nuchal lahasev otam el haTorah kula. It's not just, says the Ksava Kabbalah, related to all the Torah. Ki hu davar bilti, it's impossible. V'al korchach eino musav rak al mitzvahs yichad ve'ahava. He says, don't look at this just in terms of itself of teaching Torah or learning Torah. It's all in the general envelope of Ahavas Hashem. And I think this I don't say solves, but this explains this disconnect that sometimes exists. And I've heard various speeches over the years. You're learning Torah, you're doing all these things, and you sometimes wonder, like, what does God have to do with this? Right? You're learning a sugya, a very difficult sugya in Bava Metzia, or you're learning something in Nida, or you're learning Hilchas Shabbos, and sometimes you get lost in the forest of all these technical details. Like we spent 2 weeks, for example, in about learning about Eved Kananis and Eved Ivris, and you're like, okay, well, what does God have to do with this? And sometimes we lose track of why we're learning, at least I think. And it's always important to go back to the basics. And I think that's exactly what he's doing over here. He says you could do all the learning and all the bekiyas and all the shirim you want. He says, but it all comes back to the first pasuk of the parsha of Ve'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha. This is all part and parcel of the commandment of loving God. And because we love God, we do X, Y, and Z. We do Vishinantim, we do Ukshartem, we do Chsavtam Mezuzos. They're all subsections of the general concept of Ve'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha. I thought that's a very important Ksava Kabbalah to keep in mind, especially when, we get off topic and learning all these various things and just realize, what the ultimate goal is. So I thought that was neat. I wanted to bring in a differing opinion because the Shinantam, according to the Ibn Ezra, right, we said had to do with sharpening. According to the Sforno, he says, Vishinantam levanecha, I'm reading from the Sforno, Tilamed osam bishinun v'charifut, moftim sichliyim. Right, again, the Sforno says these far out, sometimes like last week we had a very long Sforno. Here we have one that's 6 words. He says you should teach them bishinun. So here the word shinun means repetition. Okay. but through sharp v'charifut moftim sichliim. What is moftim? I think it comes from the word like os or mofes, which is some kind of siman or evidence or something. So that's what the Sforno is saying. He says, teach him through sharp, right? Sichlium, logical evidence, meaning teach something that has value to it, something that we could take as evidence for something else. So I think that's a beautiful shot of the Sforno. And the Sifsei Chachamim, he adds one more thing. He says, Sifsei Chachamim always quotes Rashi. He says the word vishinantem is from the word lechaded, also to sharpen, right? And he quotes a pasuk in Tehillim, right? Chatzi gibor shenunim, avalo lashon mishnah. But says the Sifsei Chachamim, don't think, like we just said a minute ago from the Sforno, that it comes from the word mishnah, which is to teach. Why? De'im ken hayalolomar v'limadatem. So the Sifsei Chachamim is making a very valid point, because we already have in the parsha of Vayayim Shamoa v'limadatem is b'nechem, excuse me, right? So that means to teach. So why would the Torah go out of its way, right? The Torah uses the word lilamed, lilmod, lilamed, right? Lilmod. So many times in Devarim is the word lilmod. Why is this word vishinantem? So therefore, it can't mean what it usually means. Usually it means to teach, but here it specifically means to sharpen. Okay, a very, very subtle point that he's making, I think. Okay. Now, last, we have Rashi. Now, Rashi quotes basically our Gemara in Kiddushin, right? Our Gemara in Kiddushin that says basically on Daf Lamed, if you go back to the Gemara, the last line on the page says Tanu Rabbanan v'shinantam she'yadivrei Torah mechudadim beficha. Right? Again, it comes from the word, like we said a few minutes ago, to sharp. So what does it mean? If you have something sharp, you have something that you could attack with, right? Always be ready to attack. Adam, right? Davar al tegamgem. If someone asks you a question about a learning question, a Torah question, don't hesitate. Ela emor lo miyad. Don't take your time and say, you know what? I don't know what the answer is. When I go home, I'll check on Sfaria. I'll ask my rabbi. It says, no, be armed, right? And be ready to answer the question right away. So that's what Rashi actually quotes in Parshas Veschanan to what the word vishinantam actually means. Okay, now that's fine and dandy. So far, everything is pretty much, we'll say, positive, right? To teach or according to interpretation, Seforno, right? However you want to do it is to repeat it, to make sure that it's known to you, as the Gemara says, so that you'll have no problem relaying the information. So one of the many hundreds of commentators on Rashi actually heard a statistic last year. I think Rabbi Rosner, when he came to speak, he said something. He says there's about 790 commentators on Rashi, believe it or not. I thought that was a mind-boggling statistic, right? We take Rashi for granted because some of the times, or most of the time, Rashi doesn't give his own pshat. He quotes a Gemara, he quotes a Medrash, he quotes this, right? But there are so many interpretations on Rashi. One of them comes from the Gur Aryeh. The Gur Aryeh is the Maharal. And I was very nervous to read this because I may have heard about this once, but I've never actually seen it in writing. And I want to read most of it at least. Okay, he quotes the Maharal. Now, keep in mind, the Maharal obviously he was born in Poland, he lived in Prague. He, in the mid 1500s, he lived from like 1520 to 1600 something. His actually birth year is controversial. They're not sure if it was 1506 or 1512. Anyways, I want you to read what I mean. Not to read. I want to read what the Maharal says. He says, "Al tegamgem bahem v'hata'am." He says, "Why is it that if someone asks you a question, you don't hesitate?" So the Maharal says, "Ki tzarach shetiyeh nikras Torah so." Because it's not just learning Torah; it's when you learn something, you possess it. The pasuk in Tehillim, right, in the very first chapter says "U'b'Torah so." What does Torah so? Means his or hers, right? That person's Torah, he should toil in day and night. So what do you mean your Torah? It's not your Torah. We call it Torah Moshe. We call it. It's not our Torah. Says the Maharal. No. Once you learn it, you possess it. Nice pshat. V'gam nikras kinyano, dichsiv kilekach tov nasati lachem. It's your kinyan. V'im megamgen bahem, if you're wishy-washy, ein zeh Torah so. You don't possess it, right? It's like a football. You have to have complete control of something in order, right, for it to be a completion. In order for it to become yours, you have to possess it fully, right? So the Gur Aryeh now goes on a rant like I've never seen in my life. I don't know if how many of you in this attendance have ever seen this Maharal on this Rashi, but I'm going to start to read it. And if you had enough, someone just come in and tell me to stop reading. All right, that's what I'm going to do. Because I found it so incredible. I said, I have to read this. Ubedoros ha'elu, the Maharal goes on a complete editorial now. He says, in our generations, now keep in mind, he's writing exactly 500 years ago. Ube'artzos elu hochin nesivas akalklos. The Maharal says everything now is backwards. Choshvim lalechet lifnim lahagia lemakom cheftzam. Vihinam hem shavim achor. He says everything is in reverse. One step forward, two steps back. Askir katsas min advarim. The Maharal says, I will list a couple of problems I had. Afki ein ze mekoman. Even though this is not the right context for me to vent, but I'm going to do it anyway. Because I'm sick and tired of what I see what's going on. Torah, if Torah is asked, ain't tshuva b'fiv. People don't know anything. Lo dailanu kinim shaluka behemos nidbu, and he gets, by the way, very, very poetic. He right. This is a pasuk we say in Tehillim, right? Nimshal behemus nidbu. We're like animals. Not only are we like behemus, we're chamorim. Bloka chamorim napach livno le'even domem. We're like a rock that doesn't speak. Achtaver zenos, if it gets worse. Ki arishonim asher hayu be'erech aleinu ke'erech gagal ha'elyon legager ha'chardo. Hem alchu nesivas yosher. Our predecessors were okay. Lahadreches talmidehem b'nesivas emes. They led the straight path. Ad sheyagia el masha ra'ui. V'yata b'dor ha'pachos hazeh. Now in this bad generation, he quotes a Gemara in Bava Kama, anyusa basar anyusa. It gets worse and worse. Right? That they learn, but they don't get anything out of it. It's like you see someone building a big giant wall. He says, you don't need a foundation for this wall. It'll stand by itself. Why are you digging a foundation? Just put with the bricks on the ground. We don't need a basis. If you put a wall up without a footing, right, without some kind of foundation, it will be destroyed. And he goes on and on and on. And he says, now you see where he's getting at. He's getting at no foundation means people's knowledge is just destroyed because they don't have the proper foundation. So therefore, they don't understand anything. He says, "Kasher hayu b'doros rishonim nasnu gevulin v'itin lachanech nar al pidarko." we had this concept of, and he quotes Pirkei Avos, Benesel Mishnah, right, Bilchamish Lemikra. He says, "V'hakol kedei latet lenar masa kasher yuchal se'es lefi tivo." He says the reason why we do it is that the children, when they grow up, they could handle by nature based on their ability. Umashihu lefi tivo mikabel hanar, and he handles what's in front of him. Kamosha seder Hashem yisparach ochel leyeled chelavimo. Like when you're a baby, you start to nurse. The only thing you could eat, right? The only thing you could take in is your mother's milk. Shudavar hamakabel alav. V'lo seder lo min hamazonos asher enam lefi archo. He says you can't feed a 6-week-old baby a 3-course steak meal. V'hamazonos lefi shehem archu makabelosam. Migadol esgufa lefi tavo v'achar kach makabel mazonos yotel lefi tavo. He overeats asher gadlu. He says this was all done wrong. He says the children in his time weren't trained, and therefore they suffered and never grew up properly to have the proper foundation. And he goes on to talk about how they didn't learn Mishnah on time. And it goes on, and then the next paragraph, right, he says, Achatipshim ba'artzos elu darcheyem hefechsem, milamdim es imana'ar ma'at. I want to read this because it's like unbelievable what he says over here. He says they teach the children a few psukim from the parsha, umafsikin, and then they stop. Umatchilin b'shavua acheres parsha shniya k'tzas min parsha, and then the next week's parsha shavua they do another few psukim. Ubekolos hashana lo yadahanar. At the end of the year, the child never gets a full parsha. Ki nishkach mimenu harishon. He forgot everything he learned. Because every year, right, all they do is repeat the same thing and they never learn anything new. The Kama Shanim, and many, many, many years. Okay, so he talks about Mikra is wrong. He talks about Mishnah is wrong. He says they don't learn Rashi properly. And then the next paragraph, he starts off by saying, ready for this? Va'az ya'asok b'tosfos. All of a sudden, they open up a Gemara, and what do they do first? They go right into Tosfos. Umi ten v'hayalo ha'ikar v'lo yavakash Tosfos. He says Tosfos is a waste of time. V'od yala b'sulam lidrosh b'masas shav. Then they start hacking. Yagiel l'reik kocho. They waste their time. V'yichlu behevel yemehen. V'shanosam b'bahala. And all their years are a waste. They waste their time with Rishonim and Achronim going back and forth, banging their heads against the wall, trying to understand something that's impossible. Osef ruach b'chafnav, it's all hevel. V'hayal ruach sheker b'fiv. The davar zeh noheg ad sheyichtov ksuva leisha. They do this until they get married. Then all of a sudden they think that they know how to learn, right? Now, one could say this was in the 1500s, but I think a lot of people could say that this is from today's times also. But it's just, he goes on and on and on. I've never seen a long Maharal like this. And I don't want to spend the whole time on it. But just when you thought that, it was only him, so around the same time of the Maharal lived the Shloh HaKadosh. Now, I'm not a historian. I don't know if these two great rabbis ever crossed paths. Maybe Shmuel knows that. But I saw that the Shloh has also a very similar rant. And he says the following. He says, I'm reading from the Shloh. What you should do is you should learn it in a proper order. Sounds familiar? Don't skip, right? The parsha just because the week ended and the next week is a different parsha, right? Learn everything complete. And then he says, Shel Bein Hazmanim. I'm bringing this up for Rabbi Hertzfeld because today we call it Bein Hazmanim. Okay, so the Shloh 500 years ago said that the word Bein Hazmanim should be uprooted from our dictionary. I'm going to read the words again. Yihiyeh nekar v'nishrash min ha'olam Hashem shel bein hazmanim lo yizacher v'lo yipaked. It's getting poetic. Rakol ha'itim shavim l'tova yisnagu k'minag echad Torah. We are 4 seasons, right? Winter, spring, summer, fall. It doesn't matter, right? There's no more Asha break. There's no IO vacation in the summer. He says, he goes on and on and on, and I'm just going to stop over there. I just thought it was quite ironic how two heavyweights living at the same time both took to rant about the current situation that was going on in Prague at that time, and I think we could probably make a kal vachomer, right? Because all this was before the internet and before Snapchat, when we would waste our time, right? Just imagine today. So that's how I'm going to leave that. I do want to end on a high note, not to think that I'm such a downer, because I saw a beautiful, and it made me feel a little good. There's a commentary from the Gan Na'ul. The Gan Na'ul is a 13th century Spanish Kabbalist by the name of Avraham Abulafia. I think there's a bakery in Israel called Abulafia's somewhere in the old city. Anyway, he was a Kabbalist. He commented on the Sefer Yetzirah, okay, for what it's worth. And it made me feel good because, I have, I don't say I have a following, but I have a few people that come and listen to my class, and it's once in a while, it's good to see something positive about teaching Torah to people. And I'm sure Rabbi Herzfeld could take this passage from the Gan Na'ul also personally. He says, "V'chen mitzvat l'lamda la'acherim." He says it's a mitzvah not to learn for yourself, but to teach other people. Tzarich sheyeh bo tchila hasegulit shedibarnu mehem v'nosaf aleim tzarich sheyeh bal lashon limudim v'lev tov. L'karev lev hatalmidim el haTorah ul'haskilam ul'havinam. It's very important and very, very noble to bring your Talmidim close to Torah, ul'haskilam ul'havinam ha'inyanim ha'kashim, and to try to explain things in their own way that they could understand better, b'mishalim u'b'militzot. Different ways of a mashal, or different ways of explaining. V'tzarech lahavin harbe mitkonot hanefashot v'al yedei ken yada lahasbir lam l'chol echad v'echad kefi darko kederech v'izan chiker tiken mishalom harbe. That's a pasuk in Koheles. V'hinei mitzvah gedola v'ein era aruch eleha. There's no value. It's valueless. It's priceless. Teaching Torah to people, it's as though you gave birth to them and gave them souls. Just like the word Talmidim are synonymous with the phrase banim. Kamoi quotes a pasuk in Malachim, Vayetzu b'nei haneviim. V'alzeh amar v'shinantam levanecha. Now we come back to our point, how we started. V'shinantam levanecha kloma l'talmidecha. It's referring to your sons, obviously, but it's referring mainly to your Talmidim. Okay, so I thought that was a beautiful to end on a high note after reading this tirade by the Maharal and by the Shla about all the misguided ways of education and everything. Okay, now let's get on to part 2. Okay, part 2. Well, again, the Gemara was 2 parts. We talked about Vishinantam Levanecha, what it means, and the Gemara said, let's divide it up into 3. Okay, so what are we dividing up into 3? We're dividing Mikra, Mishnah, and Gemara. Now, the words of the Gemara are, first is, well, you should divide up your years. Okay? The Gemara says at the end, what do you mean divide up your years? Mi yodea kama chayim. How could you say that you should divide excuse me, that you should divide up your years. We don't have a crystal ball to know how many years we're going to live. If we knew that we were going to live 90 years, so therefore we do the first 30 Mikra, then Mishnah, and then Gemara. We do a third. But we don't have that luxury of knowing how many years we're going to live. So how can we do that? So the Gemara says, Lo tzriche liyome. You know what we mean? No. We divide up the yom. We divide up the day. What does Rashi say on that? Look in the side in Rashi if you have a Gemara. Rashi says, Liyome, Yemei HaShavua. Very simple. The days of the week. Look in Tosfos on the side. Tosfos says, Lo tzriche liyome, perish b'kuntras, Yemei HaShabbat. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Plomar Sheni, Shnei Yamim Mikra. Well, the week starts on Sunday. So Sunday and Monday, we learn Chumash. Tuesday, Wednesday, we learn Mishnah. Thursday, Friday, we learn Gemara. Okay, Shabbos, we do everything, but let's leave Shabbos aside for a minute. So, Velona Hira. Tosa says, I don't like that interpretation of you, Rashi, because the Imken, Akati Havimatzi Lemifrach, Miodea Kamachaye. Believe it or not, you could still ask that question, because what if you die, right, on a Wednesday, so you didn't finish the week? So you didn't divide up it. You didn't divide it up properly. So Tosa still doesn't like that interpretation. V'nir l'farish b'chol yom v'yom atzmo yishalesh. Tosa says what we're talking about over here, that not Monday, Tuesday, each day. If I have a certain amount of hours to learn, so I divide up the amount of minutes or hours by 3. So that's the way he understands it. Al-Kain Tikkun said the Rav Amram, and Tosfos ends off by saying that's why Rav Amram says, Kamosha anu nohagin b'chol yom kodem psuke dezimra lomar mikra u'mishna u'gemara. Okay, we want to get that third in very early in the morning. So therefore, in psuke dezimra we say psukim. We say a lot of psukim. We say Shema. We say Matovu. Right? You have your assortment of psukim. We say a Mishnah, if you daven Sfard and you do Karbanos, we say the Mishnah of Ezehu Makoman and Zvachim. Gemara, now what's the Gemara that we say? Gemara is referring to the Brisa of Rabbi Yishmael Omer. So in one fell swoop, we do a third before we even know what hit us. So that's the way Tosfos says we're going to solve this problem. And Tosfos ends off by saying, "Rabbeinu Tam Pirish Anu Somchen Ahadamrin in the Sanhedrin." He quotes the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Bavel Belula b'Mikra b'Mishnah u'b'Gemara. The Gemara is Bavel Balul Mekulan. We have nothing to worry about. If you learn Daf Yomi, you're made in the shade. You got your Mikra, you got your Mishnah, and you have your Gemara, right? You learn Psukim, right? You learn Mishnah and you learn your Gemara. So that's why Talmud Bavli is all-encompassing. Okay. I wanted to point out a second Pnei Yehoshua, because the Pnei Yehoshua, by the way, it's very interesting to understand that the Pnei Yehoshua was, he was a Rishon. He lived in maybe the 1700s. The story of the Pnei Yehoshua is that there was a building collapse, and everyone died except him, and he made a deal that if he were to get saved, he would devote his life to learn to write a sefer that defends Rashi against Tosfos. So here's an example where Rashi said something, and Tosfos said, "What do you mean? It can't be Monday and Tuesday, because you're back to the same question of how do you know how many years you have?" So I'm going to read the Pnei Yehoshua. He says, he quotes Tosfos, and he says, Rashi isn't so bad. Let's think about it, says the Pnei Yehoshua. I get that no one has a crystal ball to know how many years you're going to live. I get that. But it's not so bad to interpret the Gemara to mean that it could be the days of the week. Because la'olam yilmod shnei yamim harishonim mikra. He says, let's say, for example, you learn Sunday and Monday, okay? Uve'imei sachar and you die in your sleep Monday nights, okay? Says the Pnei Yoshua, ones rachmana patre. Is God going to say, you didn't finish your third for the week when you go up to Gan Eden? You died, right? And he says, and he says that's what Tosfos Rid also says. So then what's Tosfos' problem with that? Again, Rashi is not so shver, says the Pnei Yoshua. He's not so bad. So, but the Pnei Yoshua explains that Tosfos thinks the lefize bishlish shanim nami matzina lamemer ki gavna. Hold on a second. And what if you unfortunately die at age 45? So you only did the first third, and you're up to the middle of the second third. Don't you also have a claim to God and say, listen, what do you want from me? You took my life, right? I never got to do the second third. So you have the same complaint. He says you could also say it. He says, but the difference is when it comes to years, we could assume that we live to 70. Right? If you had to take an average, right, the median age is 70. So therefore, your complaint could be, hey, listen, I'm on earth 70 years. So I divide 70 by 3, I get, 23 and a half, or whatever that number is. And I'll divide it up in shlish mikra. Right? He has the same complaint. Hey, right? I figured 70. And I only got my first third or so done. So he says that's why Rashi is not so bad. Because Tosfos has one way of saying it, but the fact is that Rashi is not so, right? Tosfos, calm down, don't ask on Rashi so much, because we all have these calculations, and if you don't make it, then you could always say, Onas Rachmana Patre. It's not the end of the world. So that's the way the Pnei Yoshua explains the machloket between Rashi and Tosfos. I wanted to jump in to a very famous commentary of the Meiri, because if we take everything so far, it sounds like, okay, so we're on Earth for a certain amount of years, and we have to divide our time into learning Chumash, Mishnah, and Gemara. The problem is, what about everything else? Right? It's a very good question. What if you're going through 9 years of nursing school? What if you're going to graduate school? What if you are in law school? All of these years, or sometimes decades, of training. So how does that figure into this cheshbon? So there's a very, very short Meiri. I want to read it. He quotes the Gemara. He says, "La'olam yashlish es yama b'limuda shlish b'torah shlish b'mishnah shlish b'talmud." So far, so good. He has 6 words. Usha'ar minei machkar haru'uyim b'meh shehu lomed. So what does that mean in English? So he says you do the third and the third and the third, and the rest of Minei machkar. So the word machkar comes from the word chakira, which we translate it as investigations, or basically deep diving into something. Whatever our chakiros we need, hara'uyin b'meshu lomed. If I'm learning something and I want to understand it better, if I'm learning zra'im, but I have no idea what is going on because I don't know what grafting means. I don't know what it's like to take a vine and to stick it in the ground and to do. I'm learning Malachas Shabbos. I don't know anything about weaving. I can't understand the whole perek that devotes 12 blots about weaving and what a batenir is and what a loom looks like. And right, or I'm learning Nida, and I have no idea what the female anatomy looks like. Or I'm learning Chulin and Elotraphis, and nothing makes sense because, again, the days before picture books, right, where we had all these nice, 3D images, I have no idea what the intestines or anything in an animal looks like. So all the Torah I'm learning is going one ear out the other ear. So that's exactly why the Meiri stands up and says, if you need, we'll call it secular education, to fill in your understanding, to make the Torah that you're learning meaningful, then by all means, that is part and parcel of this third. Now, to us, this doesn't seem controversial at all. This sounds like a no-brainer, right? I mean, of course, we want to understand. We want to understand Bava Metzia and the laws of interest and the laws of acquisitions. So if we don't understand something, how finance works, we have to take a course in order for this Gemara to become, for us to familiarize with all these concepts. So this is exactly, in a nutshell, what the Meiri is talking about. I don't want to call it a heter for secular subjects, but this is, from what I could see, this is really the springboard into. I mean, the Meiri was, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. He lived in the 1400s or something like that, the 1300s. So here he's saying, yes, to make your Torah better, you have to learn whatever it takes, right? I think the Gemara in Chulin, in the first chapter of Chulin, it says that Rav lived on a farm for I don't know how many years, 10 years, in order for him to understand what an animal, how he behaved, what his insides look like. You can't paskin trephis if you don't know what an animal looks like. So what are you going to say, that studying biology doesn't fit into the Mikra Mishnah or right? Of course it does. So that's why I think this is a very, very important about secular subjects. The problem is that there are some. I'm just going to bring down a couple of Gemaras. For example, there's a Gemara in Menachos. At the end of Menachos, Daf Tzadik Tes Amud Beis, that might throw some cold water on this, but we have to understand each Gemara in context. The Gemara says, let me find it. Sha'al ben Dama ben Achosus Rabbi Ishmael. That's Rabbi Ishmael. Kagon Ani ben Dama, the nephew, the son of Rabbi Ishmael's sister, asked his uncle Rabbi Ishmael, Kagon Ani. He said, for example, me. Shalimadi Kol Torah Kula. I went through Shas. Mahu Lilmod Chachma Yavanis. Can I learn philosophy? Karolav HaMikra Hazeh. So he says, okay, you're finished. You want to find time to learn philosophy? Great. So I'll answer you by the pasuk says, it says, Lo yomush sefer Torah hazeh mipicha v'higita bo yomam v'layla. Right, a pasuk in the beginning of Yehoshua. So he says, here's the deal. Zeu badok shah she'eno lo min hayom v'lo min halayla. So the pasuk says you have to learn Torah day and night. So you could learn philosophy if you want. Just figure out a time when to learn it that doesn't contradict the pasuk of day or night. If you could, now obviously all this is facetious because there is no time except in Hashmashos, but putting that aside, he's saying it sarcastically. If you find a time of day that's not day and it's not night, then as they say, knock yourself out. Then you could learn it. So, okay, so now you're going to say, well, what did he want to learn? He wants to learn Chachma Yavanis. Tosfos over there says, how could you even talk about Chachma Yavanis? There's 3 Gemaras in Shas that say Chachma Yavanis is a problem. Okay, put that question aside, but we see that it's not so simple. Now, again, this Gemara came way, way before the Meiri. Here's another one, the Sifri in Dvarim, chapter 34. The Dibartabam, it quotes our pasuk in Shema. Asam ikar v'al tasem tefela. Torah should be the ikar, not the tafel. Shlo yeh ma'asacha u'matancha ela alehem. Right? Make the words of the Torah primary, and your dealings should only be in them. Don't mix it with other things. Shalo tomar limadati chachma Yisrael. Don't say, I finished learning everything about Judaism. Elech ve'elmod chachma umos ha'olam. Now I want to take courses in ancient Middle East or Far East philosophy. I want to learn about Shintoism. That's what I want to devote my next 2 years to. Don't think that. Talmud Lomar Ushmarta mitzvosasai lalechet bahem. V'lo lipater mitoch. And the pasuk says you should walk, right? You should walk in my mitzvos and not depart. So you see where this is going. You see that we're getting a little bit conflicting, or is it not conflicting? So I don't think it's really a kasha with these Gemaras, because again, it depends what the end goal is. If you're curious because you think you've conquered everything you know, everything that there is to know about Judaism, you're obviously wrong, because it's never ending. So if you have time and you say, well, what am I going to do with that time? Am I going to take my time and learn Japanese or learn a foreign language? Or can I open up a new Masechta? So I think we all know what the answer to that is. So that's why, it's all a question of using time wisely. I saw a off the charts Pele Yoetz. Okay. The Pele Yoetz, also a Moroccan Kabbalist, 500-600 years ago. We've had him before in the past. I want to read what he says over here. He says, Amnam Kidelios Kamo Yisachar Uzavulun. He's talking about people who learn and people who support, like the Yisachar Zvulun relationship. Tzarich lahaspik l'talmid chacham demach zaro ashayach zolo ba'ofen shelo yihye lo shum tirda. If you're supporting someone who's learning, then great, then support him. V'yoser tov lahachzik biyad talmid chacham echad v'litem lo demach zaro milahachzik yeshiva shel asara talmidei chachamim v'latet lahem ma'at pras. If you have a choice, you're presented with an opportunity to support a kollel where you pay $1,000 a month, and that is divided into 10 people, and 10 people are getting $100 a month, or you could support one real gadol for $1,000 a month. What do? Now, it's funny because I think the Rambam says if you give $100 to tzedakah to one person, that's not as good as giving 100 people a $1 bill. Here, when it comes to supporting Yisachar Zvulun, very interesting. When it comes to kollels, Shmuel, you may have something what to say on this. Maybe not now, maybe for later. It's better to give one real top gun the money rather than to spread it out. Then he says something phenomenal. He says, "V'afa pishu machzik biyad lomdei haTorah ein poter oso mila asuk b'Torah kivikocho liitot hapanai sha'ach hatalmid chacham shetoraso minaso v'lomed kol haTorah kulo lo nitno lo rishus lasek b'dvarim batelim." You can't be bato ela b'shah she'eno lo min hayom v'lo min halayla. Right? Again, it sounds like he's saying what we said before about how if you're learning, you can't learn anything else. He says an ending that the Sifri did not say. And I think this is very important. He says, Rak zeh kol pri hamachzik shenechshav lo b'sha'a shehu osek b'pragmatia ki'ilu osek b'Torah. However, if he does do work on the side, that time that he's devoting to his business is as valuable as he's learning Torah. Very interesting. We've had over the last couple of years, somehow we got onto these segues about the importance of work and it equals to learning. Here you see another, and Rachel Eliza, is she on this class? She's not. But anyway, she's been asking me about various sources. Here's another one about the virtues of working. And here you see an example where the Peleiotes is actually equating, right? He's equating the hours you spend to support yourself, to make a living, as though you're learning. I found one other Gemara at the end of Maseches Shabbos, interesting Gemara that says, Amar Rav Zutra Bar Tuvia Amarav, Hamotea chut shel tefira b'Shabbos chayiv chatas, v'halom medavarech min hamagush chayiv misa. Okay, forget those two things. V'hayodea lechashev tkufos u'mazalos ve'eno mechashev asur l'saper heimenu. It says if someone is intelligent enough, who knows how to calculate the seasons and astrology and all the movement of the stars, and he doesn't do so, a person is not allowed to speak with him because he's taking this potential that he has and he's wasting it. And the Ben Yehoyada goes on to a whole arichas over here, and he says the reason is because hakavana shalol saper b'shvacho. The point is, no, don't praise him and say, oh, he's so smart, he's so this, he's so intellectual. Shalo yisapru b'inyanav u'maisev shemagia lo shvach behem. V'zeh mida keneged mida. Ki b'cheshbon tekufas u'mazalos yesh shvach liYisrael. Because when you figure out the cheshbon and the tekufa, that's a praise for the Jewish people. Why? Shenikraim b'zeh am chacham v'navon. Right? The pasuk umi kamcha Yisrael. Right? Am chacham v'navon. V'kiven dema'as b'chvod hashvach. He doesn't want to contribute and help figure things out. L'kach lo yiskabed b'sipur shvacho. Therefore, we can't talk about his shvach in front of people also. I thought that was a very interesting shot on that Gemara. Let's learn a little halacha now. So now that we know that we have to spend a third, let's see what the contemporary poskim decide. So we have in the forefront, we have the Rambam. The Rambam says, V'chayiv l'shalash ezman l'midaso. So the Rambam says you have to split up your right, shlish mikra, shlish Torah, Torah shebechsav, Torah shebal peh. Now he doesn't say the word Gemara yet. The Rambam describes a few lines what the Gemara was all about. He says, Ushlish yavin v'yaskil achris davar merishaso. Right, he has to understand and conceptualize the ultimate derivation of a concept from its roots. And he has to infer one concept from another by comparing concepts and understanding the 13 midos. To know how these prohibitions that he's learning about and other decisions, according to their tradition, can be used on how to derive them. The inyan zeh hu nikra Gemara. And that, in a nutshell, is what today we call the Gemara, because that's what the Gemara is. It goes back and forth, figuring out sources and how to learn that. And if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, I just want to quote in the next minute or two, we have the Shulchan Aruch that says the following law. We are in Shulchan Aruch, the Yoredea 246. Let's see, do I have it? Oops, I forgot to put it down, but it's funny because the Rambam, let me just do a quick in Safaria, because the Rambam basically quotes it word for word, but the Shulchan Aruch has an interesting Ramah that I want to end with. So just bear with me 1 second. And Yoredea 246. Here we go. So first of all, what is Torah Shebechsav? The Shulchan Aruch says it's the 24 books, right? That's the 929. Shlish b'Mishnah dahainu Torah Shebal Peh. Uperish Torah Shebechsav b'chlal zeh shlish b'Talmud dahainu sheyavin v'yaskel achris Torah. Okay, he quotes the Rambam, and he says something interesting. The next Rambam says Ketzad. Let's talk Lamaisa, as they say. Hayabal umnus. The guy works. Now, what is a work they comprise of? So today we call it 9 to 5. The Shulchan Aruch, who quotes the Rambam, says, let's say, for example, V'osik b'mlachtu gimel shaos b'yom. I found this very humorous because to them, a workday was 3 hours, right? This is like Israel today, right? In a bank. Let's say your workday is 3 hours. The test b'Torah. So you have a 12-hour day. So how do I divide it? You work for 3 hours, right? You're blessed to have you're a dentist and you set your own appointments. So your day is 3 hours of working and 9 hours of Torah. So how do you divide 9? Gimel mehem b'Torah shebechsav, Gimel b'Torah shebal peh, Ubegimel yavin davar mitoch davar, and the third is Gemara. This is when a person just starts to learn how to learn. When after many decades, when he's proficient in learning Torah, after a while, you don't necessarily need to spend so much time on Torah Shebechsav, 9-9. Okay, so once in a while you'll have a 9-9 class. The Divrei Torah Shabal Peh Kedei Shel Yishkach Davar Medinei Torah V'Yifne Kol Yomav L'Talmud B'Libo L'Firochav Le V'Yishav Adaito. So what he's basically saying is that after he becomes proficient, he doesn't need so much the Torah Shebechsav, right? He could read the Torah Shebechsav at certain times and the words of Torah Shebal Peh so that he doesn't forget anything from the laws of the Torah. And the rest of his days, let him just study Talmud by itself to the extent of his abilities. So says the Rama, and we'll end with this. So the Rama quotes our Gemara that the Rabbeinu Tam said, well, because Talmud Bavli is mixed, right? That's the word Bavel comes from. It comes from the word Balal, right? Mikra, Mishnah, Gemara. Adam yotzei yedei chavaso b'shvil hakol. The Ein Adam. Now, so far we only learned what you could learn. Is there anything that you can't learn? The Ein Adam lilmod ki im Mikra, Mishnah, Gemara v'haposkin hamishachim achareim b'zeh yikneh ha'olam haza. I'm reading from the Rama. Don't think learning other philosophies of the world will get you anywhere. You can do it once in a while. You can't learn heresy. You can't go what the Gemara in Chagiga says, spatziring or trespassing into the pardes. It's like today, right? You could go online and take Kabbalah classes, and you can't even say the Aleph base, right? What business do people have learning Kabbalah, right, before they know anything, right? So yeah, you could learn it, but you have to be filled up with Basar and Yayin, meaning you have to know Shulchan Aruch first. You have to know Rishonim and Achronim. And then, if you're bored, you could take Kabbalah classes from the Kabbalah Center. But anything before that, he says it's off limits. Right? That's what the key is, to know Isser V'Heter, so you know how to paskin shilas. Don't go start learning Kabbalah before you know anything else. So that there's a few other things, but it's 9:05 already. Questions?